You are surrounded by people. You are more reachable, more visible, more connected than any human being in history. And yet, in the winter of 1961, a Swiss-German writer named Max Frisch published a novel that would quietly unsettle everyone who read it. The book was Homo Faber, and at the center of it was a man named Walter Faber, an engineer, a rational man, a man who had organized his entire life around efficiency and precision and the avoidance of anything that couldn't be measured. He had colleagues, he had acquaintances, he traveled constantly, ate well, worked hard. By every external measure, he was a person fully embedded in the world, and he was one of the loneliest characters in 20th century literature. Not lonely in the way that is visible, not lonely in the way that announces itself, lonely in the way that has no name, because it coexists so completely with the appearance of being connected that even the person experiencing it cannot always identify what is wrong. Frisch spent years before writing that novel, keeping detailed diaries, journals that his estate eventually published, and that reveals something striking. He was surrounded constantly by people who admired him, friends, lovers, colleagues, readers. He was feted and discussed and sought out. He traveled in the best literary circles of Europe, and the journals are suffused with a loneliness he could not explain and could not escape. Not the loneliness of rejection, not the loneliness of invisibility, the loneliness of a man who was seen everywhere and known nowhere. He was trying, in Homo Faber, to describe something he had observed in himself and in everyone around him, a kind of hollowness that persists inside even the fullest life. Not loneliness in the sense of being alone, loneliness in the sense of being beside, present without being reached, known without being understood, surrounded without being met. Buddhism had a word for the condition Frisch was trying to describe. It had been there for 2,500 years, waiting for the right historical moment to become urgently relevant. That moment is now. You are at a dinner with people you've known for years. The conversation moves. It's good, actually. There's laughter, there's wine, there are stories you've told before, and stories you haven't heard. And somewhere around the second hour, a feeling arrives that you don't quite have a word for. Not boredom, not dissatisfaction, something quieter, a slight sense of being slightly elsewhere, of performing your presence rather than simply being present, of smiling at the right moments, responding at the right moments, and noticing from somewhere just behind your eyes that none of this is quite reaching you. You say something genuine, something that would have led somewhere, in a different conversation, with a different quality of attention, and it lands on the surface and floats there before the topic moves on, and you let it move. Because the effort of going deeper in this particular room, in this particular moment, feels like more than the situation can hold. You go home. The evening was fine. There is nothing wrong. And yet you feel, if you're honest, slightly more alone than before you went. Or you're lying in bed at the end of a day, that was full, genuinely full, meetings and calls and conversations, people who needed things from you and got them, and you reach for your phone, not because there's something you want to see, but because the alternative is to lie there with the silence, which has something in it you're not quite ready to face. So you scroll past things you've already seen, past updates from people you haven't spoken to in months, past the curated evidence of other people's fullness, their dinners and their travels, and they're looking happy, and you put the phone down, feeling somehow slightly worse than before you picked it up. Most people recognize this. Most people have no idea what to do with it. The cultural response to loneliness, the entire industry of solutions, is based on a misdiagnosis. It assumes that loneliness comes from not enough contact, that the cure is more connection, more events, more relationships, more outreach, more notifications, more of the thing that is already everywhere and somehow not working. But the loneliness most people in the modern world carry is not the loneliness of isolation. It is the loneliness of insufficient depth. You have contact, you have conversation, you may have hundreds of people who would describe themselves as your friends. What you may not have, what is increasingly rare, what the structure of modern life has made structurally difficult to maintain, is the specific experience of being genuinely known by another person, not known about. Known, the difference between those two things is the difference between a photograph of a place and actually being there. Both contain accurate information. Only one of them is real. There is a reason this particular loneliness has become so widespread, precisely as the world became more connected. And it is not a coincidence, and it is not a personal failing. Buddhism understood the mechanism long before the internet existed to make it visible. The word is dukkha. We've encountered it before in this series, in the context of the second arrow of grief that circles, of the grinding friction of a life, organized around unexamined pain. But dukkha has three distinct registers. In the Buddhist understanding, and the one most relevant here, is the subtlest of the three. The first register is dukkha, ordinary suffering, the pain that announces itself, the loss, the illness, the failure. The things you know are wrong because they hurt. The second register is viparinama-dukkha, the suffering of change, the grief that arrives when good things end, when the meal is over, when the holiday finishes, when the relationship shifts, the particular ache of impermanence. The third register, the one that describes what we're talking about, is Saṅkhāra-dukkha, the suffering of conditioned existence itself, not the suffering of any particular thing going wrong, the suffering that is baked into the structure of being a separate self in a world that is fundamentally, constitutionally unsatisfying. At its core, Saṅkhāra-dukkha is the low hum, the background radiation of dissatisfaction, the sense that something is slightly off, even when nothing specific is wrong. It is what you feel at the dinner table, when the evening is going well, and you are still somehow not quite there. It is what you feel scrolling through your phone at 11 at night, already having seen everything, reaching for more of it anyway. Not because you want what's there, but because the act of reaching temporarily quiets something that has no name. It is what you feel in the gap between the conversation you just had and the one you actually wanted to have, the one that would have required more honesty, more exposure, more willingness to be seen in a way that might not have been comfortable for either of you. Most people, when they feel Saṅkhāra-dukkha, reach for more contact, more stimulation, more content, more conversation, more activity. This is the misdiagnosis in action, because Saṅkhāra-dukkha is not caused by insufficient contact. It is caused by the gap between the surface of connection and its depth, and adding more surface does not close the gap. It widens it. The researcher, Robert Weiss, who spent decades studying loneliness at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the 1970s, made a distinction that most subsequent research has confirmed. There is social loneliness. The loneliness of not having enough people in your life, and there is emotional loneliness. The loneliness of not having the right kind of connection with the people who are there. Social loneliness responds to more contact. Emotional loneliness does not. In fact, Weiss found that people experiencing emotional loneliness who were placed in highly social environments, more parties, more gatherings, more contact, often felt worse, not better, because the gap between what was available and what was actually needed became more visible, not less. You can be lonelier in a crowd than you are alone. Most people know this. Buddhism understood why. The Buddhist concept most relevant here is not dukkha itself, but the condition it describes, puthujjana, the ordinary, unawakened person, the one who moves through the world, taking the surface of things for reality. The puthujjana is not stupid. The puthujjana is not unfeeling. The puthujjana is simply someone who has not yet looked past the appearance of connection to ask what connection actually requires. And what connection actually requires is terrifying. It requires exposure. It requires the willingness to be seen in a way that might not be received well. It requires saying the true thing instead of the comfortable thing, which means accepting the risk that the true thing will create distance rather than closeness. Most people, most of the time, manage this risk by not taking it, by staying at the level where connection is safe, the level of shared opinion, shared experience, shared surface. This is not dishonesty. This is self-protection. Rational, understandable, completely human self-protection. And it is also, over time, the mechanism that produces the specific loneliness of the modern world. We have become extraordinarily skilled at the performance of connection. We know how to seem interested. We know how to seem warm. We know how to share just enough to create the impression of intimacy without creating intimacy itself. And the digital world has turbocharged this capacity. It has given us a medium that is almost perfectly optimized for the performance of connection, for the carefully selected disclosure, the vulnerability that has been edited before it is posted, the emotional share that can be calibrated to produce the response you want without the risk of the response you didn't want. This is not cynicism about technology. It is an observation about what happens to human beings when they are given a medium that offers the rewards of connection without requiring its costs. They take the rewards. Of course they do. And they wonder, quietly, why the feeling of being known keeps not arriving, and they reach for more. The philosopher Simone Weil, writing in France in the 1940s, in circumstances that gave her extensive experience of both community and isolation, described what she called creative attention, the rare capacity to be present to another person, not with the goal of helping them, not with the goal of understanding them, not even with the goal of connecting with them, but simply with the quality of attention that says, I see you, not I see what I think you are, not I see what I need you to be, I see you. She argued that this quality of attention is the rarest thing one human being can offer another, and that its absence, even in relationships full of goodwill and warmth, is the source of a loneliness that no amount of social contact can remedy. Buddhism would recognize this immediately. The practice of metta, loving kindness, is at its deepest level a practice of this quality of attention. The formal practice asks you to hold another person in mind and genuinely wish for their well-being, not as you imagine it, not as you need it to be, but as they would define it for themselves. This sounds simple. It is, in practice, one of the most difficult things the human mind attempts, because to genuinely wish for someone's well-being as they would define it, rather than as you would define it, requires first seeing them clearly enough to know the difference. And most of us, most of the time, are seeing people through the filter of what we need from them, what we fear from them, what we have already decided about them. The loneliness that persists inside full lives is partly the loneliness of never quite being seen past the filter and of never quite seeing past your own. There is something I want to say plainly before we go any further. The loneliness of insufficient depth is not going to be solved by deciding to have deeper conversations. This is the part most people skip to, and it is also the part that doesn't work. You cannot decide your way into genuine connection any more than you can decide your way into genuine sleep. The decision to try harder, to be more open, to share more, to be more present. These are all good intentions, and they will not, by themselves, close the gap, because the gap is not a gap in intention. It is a gap in practice, in the slow accumulation of the kind of time and repetition and exposure that genuine knowing requires, and that accumulation is in direct conflict with almost everything about the way modern life is structured, the pace of it, the mobility of it, the way it fragments communities and relocates people and replaces long-term relationships with networks of acquaintances that feel like friendships from the outside, the way it offers, constantly, the simulation of depth the carefully curated vulnerability, the emotional share that gets 30 likes, the parasocial relationship, with a voice in your earbuds that feels like it knows you, without requiring any of the actual cost. Because genuine depth costs something. It costs the risk of being misunderstood. It costs the discomfort of being seen in a state that is less than your best. It costs the slow, unglamorous work of showing up consistently for people who will also, sometimes, disappoint you. The simulation of depth costs nothing, and it delivers nothing, but it is available at all hours, in unlimited quantities, algorithmically optimized to feel like exactly what you needed. This is the particular cruelty of the modern loneliness. The cure is available in endless supply, and none of it works. And here is the harder thing to say. Some of the relationships you are in may not have the capacity to go where you need them to go, not because the people in them don't care, but because the channel between you never opened at the right depth, because the conditions for depth were never quite present. And at this point in both of your lives, changing that would require more than either of you is able to offer. That is not a failure. That is an honest assessment. And it means that some of the loneliness you carry is the loneliness of relationships that cannot give you what you need from them. Not because they're broken, because they were always a different thing than what you needed them to be. If you are in your 40s or 50s and you are sitting with this recognition that the fullness of your life has not prevented a certain kind of loneliness from taking up residence in it, I want to offer something that is not a solution, but might be a reframe. The loneliness you feel is not a sign that you have failed at connection. It is a sign that you understand, at a level that younger people rarely reach, what connection actually requires. Most people in their 20s move through social life, sustained by the feeling of possibility that any of the people around them might become the person who truly knows them, that depth is just around the corner, that the right conversation is coming. By the time you've accumulated a few decades, you know something that the younger version of you didn't. Genuine knowing is rare. It takes longer than you thought. It requires more than you expected. And there are people you will know for years who will never quite reach you, not because they don't care, but because the channel between you never opened at the right depth. That knowledge is not despair. It is precision. And precision, in this context, is something you can work with. The Buddhist teaching on connection is not that you should have more of it. It is that you should have the right quality of it. And that quality requires a specific kind of attention that can be practiced slowly in the relationships that are already there, not new relationships. The ones you have, the one person in your life with whom you are most consistently almost honest. The relationship where depth is available, but rarely reached, because both of you have learned to stay at a level that is comfortable and safe. That is where the work is, not in adding more people, in going slightly further with the ones who are already present. The one thing I'd like to leave you with is not a practice. It is a question, one that might be more useful than any instruction I could give. Think about the person in your life with whom you are most consistently almost honest. The relationship where something real is available between you, but rarely accessed, where you both know it is there, and both, by unspoken agreement, tend to stay at a level that is easier and safer. The next time you are with that person, not in a grand planned conversation, but in an ordinary moment, a meal, a walk, the end of a phone call, ask yourself, what is the thing I almost said just now? Not to say it, just to notice it. What was the thing that came to the surface and then went back down before it reached your voice? Because that thing, the unsaid thing, the almost said thing, the thing that chose safety at the last moment, that is where the loneliness lives. Not in the absence of people, in the gap between what is available and what is actually exchanged. Max Frisch's Walter Faber never quite learned this. He understood the world in terms of what could be measured, and the distance between two people cannot be measured. It can only be crossed, and crossing it requires something that measurement cannot provide, the willingness to be seen. In the moment before you know how it will be received, that is the practice, not a scheduled vulnerability, not a conversation you've planned in advance. Just the willingness, in one ordinary moment, to let the almost said thing become the said thing. Not every time, not even most of the time, just once, and then again, and then again. That is how depth accumulates, not in grand gestures, in small, repeated acts of choosing not to go back down. If something in this landed somewhere quiet, somewhere you hadn't quite looked before, don't rush past it. Let it sit with you. The loneliness that has no name is the loneliness that has never been spoken. Maybe the first step is speaking it to yourself. Next time, we're going to reach the end of this series. The question that everything we've explored has been circling around without quite arriving. What happens when someone you love is no longer the person you fell in love with? Not because they left, not because they changed dramatically, but because time moved through both of you, and the movement was different, and the distance between who you were and who you are now is larger than either of you expected. Anicca, impermanence, the oldest teaching there is. I'll see you there. And if this has been worth your time, the simplest thing you can do is stay.